have here with me Frédéric Filloux. Thank you, Frédéric, for being here with us today. And I will talk with Frédéric about how Silicon Valley is transforming news business. Frédéric Filloux is a French entrepreneur and journalist. He is the creator and founder of Deepnews.ai and Monday Note, which is a blog and newsletter for digital business new models for news media. Is that right, Frédéric?
That's right, absolutely.
And Frédéric has a huge experience in journalism, media, business model for the digital age. And Frédéric, I would like to ask you to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm very glad to be in this exchange. So my background is, as you noticed, both a journalist and an entrepreneur. I was the editor of various newspapers, and we called that at the time, and a news organization in France. My last real job, so to speak, was that I was the chief digital officer for Les Echos Group in Paris. And then I spent 2 years at Stanford as a fellow, a journalism fellow, where I started my project, which was called at the time News Quality Scoring, and which later took the name of Deepnews.ai, which is a company that I do not run. I have a CEO, but I'm still the majority shareholders of the company.
Okay, thank you so much, Frédéric. Now, you have such wonderful experience in media and journalism and technology. Yeah, so how do this different area converge in what you are doing right now?
Well, it converges in several ways. The first one is as a journalist, because I continue writing, as you mentioned, for my blog and newsletter, The Monday Note. Also, I'm writing both column and investigative piece for a French magazine called L'Express. I mean, as a journalist, I pretend to be an observer of the news ecosystem and the news business and the technology and everything. So being a journalist allows me to remain very much in touch with what's going on in the technological and scientific field, because what I'm doing now with Deep News is actually bordering well, not bordering, it's quite an involvement in data science and stuff. And my background as someone who has been writing for technology for a while also give me some capabilities in order to have a technical and business approach of the news media as well. So I pretend to have an editorial view on what we are doing at Deep News, which is about scoring quality and surfacing good content from the internet. So that's my editorial expertise has been, I think, quite useful in devising what is news quality. And also I pretend to have some kind of more business and economics-like approach for it.
Thank you. So this sounds really, really interesting. Now, you worked a lot in the area of tech, and that means, of course, you had to do with Google, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and all the big tech giants. And I know, reading your Monday Note, that you have a very clear perspective on that. So first of all, I would like to ask you, where do you see the benefits from the cooperation with GAFA? And what could news media learn from them?
Okay, my experience with so-called GAFA came from the fact that I was quite involved in the Google Digital News Initiative, which is called now Global News Initiative. When I was working for Les Echos, the French business outlet in France, we were kind of we were at the core of the beginning of this initiative. So I've been able to see firsthand what was their approach. And also I've been able also to see the difference in terms of mentality towards the news ecosystem between Google and Facebook. And it is totally different. At Google, you have people who genuinely are interested in news. You have people who believe deeply that having an healthy news ecosystem is absolutely essential for the society. Facebook has a different approach. Facebook is working mostly for themselves. Their involvement with the news ecosystem is basically in function of the public relation and communication benefit they can get from. So that's a completely different approach. I would say that, if I can be blunt a little bit, I would say that Facebook approach towards news is way more cynical than Google is. At Google, you really have people coming from the news ecosystem at a very high level, who are, again, convinced that they need to do their fair share in order to maintain an healthy news ecosystem. That's why they came up with a lot of initiative in which they are spending, I think, nearly 1 or 2 billions a year now, if you take into account everything. And but yes, on the other hand, they have been kind of damaging the news ecosystem as well. So it's a kind of give and take approach, I would say.
Is there anything that you did learn from Google that you could use as a journalist?
Well, what I saw with them is that the importance of having a technological approach for media is absolutely critical. They have been a stimulating force in order for media company to get modernized when it's come to technology. I tend to believe, and I honestly very much suffered from that when I was an executive in the media industry, that it is very hard to convince the management of a news media company to invest heavily in technology. I remember having to wage battles with my management to hire engineers, and some people were saying to me, well, why should we have 4 engineers and stuff? There is no quote unquote return on investment about engineers. And so, working with Google, for instance, help us and help the management I was working for and I was part of to get convinced that having high-level technicians, engineers was absolutely crucial for the development of a company, and having them working on the product, working on the underlying infrastructure technology, and having working engineers working in the ad tech business as well.
Did you notice any change in the mindset in the news media since you had this experience? Do you think that news media went a little bit further in the acceptance of new technologies?
That's a very good question. I think it is very uneven from one country to another and from one media ecosystem to another. By and large, I tend to believe that the shift toward technology is still very slow, and I tend to believe that media companies are currently vastly underinvested in when it comes to technology. So there is very much to grow, I think.
Yeah, that's true. That's why you have your Monday note with the
I try to stimulate the discussion with my Monday note, but
yeah, that's very important. I think it's very. And by the way, going back to Monday note, I come to my next questions, because my next question is actually the title of one of your blogs in December. Did Google and Facebook kill the media revenue model? I think this is the most important questions here.
Yeah, that was some kind of bestseller for the Monday Note in the year 2020. Yeah. Although it's a free product, so there is no bestseller, unfortunately. I'm not very good at making money. No, I think it's a valid question, and I think that honestly, platforms. Although I harbor different views from my peers in the news media industry when it comes to platforms and GAFA and stuff, I'm much less hysterical than many of them are. But I think that platforms are in some denial when it comes to the damages they have done to the industry. I would say that they did not do any damages intentionally. They did not wake up one day and saying, okay, we are going to wipe out the news industry and we're going to capture whatever they want. It was much more a consequence of what they have been building. What they did is that these companies, Google, Facebook, and so on, and including Amazon, which is now a huge player in the advertising industry, they build incredibly performing advertising machines. Suddenly, when they came into play, we came from an era in which, as the former businessman of the 19th century, John Wanamaker, said, I invest in newspaper, I do some ads in newspaper, I know that half of them is working, but I don't know which half. Suddenly, those people came with a very precise notion of who was benefiting from their ads, what could be the fair price, and so on and so forth. So they built an incredibly granular machine in which they were able to target and to measure advertising, which was the opposite of what we have been doing in the newspaper industry for 2 centuries. So that was the real change, and we got that into our face without measuring what was going to be the impact of it. Suddenly, advertisers, brands, the commercial sphere was able to measure the potential of an advertising, which was a thing that the newspaper industry was never able to provide to the advertisers. That's point number one. Point number two, in this process, we realized that making an advertisement in newspapers, in news organization by and large, was hugely expensive compared to the benefit that the advertisers were getting. So suddenly we realized that whether it is in terms of GDP, whether it is in terms of fair price and so on, we realized that advertising in a news organization was indeed very expensive compared to these platforms had to offer. So what ensued is a very steep deflation in the price of advertising, which proved to be extremely damageable for the news industry. And the other leg of it is the shift from the reader in which they were having some kind of trusted relationship with news brand, to an era in which there is a huge dilution of the news brand in the whole noise, in the whole maelstrom of news, of stuff which is available on social media and things. So combined with that, we had an incredible, damage which has been made to the news industry.
Yeah, that is absolutely true. And we are still, there are now years and years that we as news media, we are still looking for the right business models and now for reader revenues. I think the COVID and the pandemic was a huge increase for many newspaper houses regarding reader revenues and new revenue streams. And these are some opportunities that we see out there. But what are the opportunities that you see when publishers deal with this kind of threats from the big platforms?
I tend to believe that publishers, and I'm not blaming them because they made this mistake in a kind of genuine way, and no one could able to see that. I think that publisher made a series of mistakes by trying to go into their ecosystem. If you take Facebook, for instance, with the advent of digital media, publishers had the opportunity to reconnect directly with their audience on a kind of individual basis. They are suddenly at the way and means to know who was reading their stuff, who was viewing their content on video, and who was listening their podcasts and stuff in a very, very granular way. But the problem is, since they were so lured, attracted, fascinated by the power of the internet giants, they tend to recreate some kind of level of intermediation by going with Facebook, by going with Google and stuff. I'm not saying that they should not work with that. For instance, if you take Facebook, for instance, Facebook is a fantastic tool to test the market, to find new market, to explore things and so on and so forth. I think it is a terrible thing to actually distribute information, because suddenly you will produce your content, your content will find its way into a newsfeed in which it will be selected through an algorithm. So my point being is that number one, media should reconnect with their reader much more than they used to do. Secondly, they should go for uniqueness, the kind of stuff that they won't be able to be, no one could find good content elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Les Echos, Le Monde, the New York Times, The Guardian, El País and stuff are companies which are known to provide unique content, super value-added content that cannot be found elsewhere. This should be the competitive field. So they should work on this, invest much more in journalism, invest in, again, unique, valuable, differentiating content. That should be their strategy. So when it comes to working with platforms, as we call them, again, I mean, if you want to test a market, you go on Facebook. If you want to have social presence, okay, go on Facebook, Instagram and stuff. That should be something. If you want to be noticed and so on, be good in Google search and everything. Use the accelerated mobile pages system in Google to have super fast pages and stuff. So there are some bricks to take from this company, but by and large, I think what matters, it is the relationship between a publisher and their readers.
Yeah, brilliant. So I like this very much. So the relationship with the reader and uniqueness of content. Mm-hmm. And of course, the big media houses can allow themselves to invest a lot in this. But what would be your suggestion for a smaller local media house? Where do you see there the possibility to deal with the threat of the big platforms?
I think it's going, I mean, I think for the local press is going to be very hard, because in purely economic terms, if you are, I don't know, a mechanic in a city nearby, the best way to advertise is through Google, or maybe Facebook, or through Google mostly. This is where you will be able to find your customer in a very granular way and with a very measurable success rate, not in the newspaper, unfortunately. So I tend to believe that when it comes to the local press is, I'm sorry to say, is likely to disappear. Some will survive with niche product, again, providing, if you have, I don't know, in a small community, what's used to be a news organization providing great newsletters about something with very strong, different and editorial and very high quality editorial, that could make sense. They could have some subscribers and stuff. But the idea of having a fairly powerful local newspaper is unfortunately completely forgotten. At some point, I tend to believe that if we project ourselves 10 years from now, of course, I have my concern as someone who loves the news ecosystem, who loves the news and who believes in the importance of journalism and more crucially to the importance of the notion of informed citizen. This notion of informed citizen is quite kind of in jeopardy right now. When it comes to the interaction between publishers and platforms, I think that increasingly platforms can find ways, kind of naturally find ways to subsidize the press at some point, under the pressure of the publishers themselves, under the pressure of regulators, under the pressure of government and stuff, because they see this huge discrepancy, this huge gap there is between a news industry, which is now engaged in a super fast downfall, and the continuous rise of platforms which are making huge amount of money. So at some point, we might see a kind of rebalance in that field. However, I mean, I'm not sure it's going to be completely beneficial for numbers of reasons. The first one, and I'm French, and I know what I'm talking about because that's the case in France. In France, the news ecosystem has always been very heavily subsidized.
Mm.
And we can see that subsidies is not the best way to foster innovation. If you subsidize something, you basically kill innovation. That's a fact. Okay. So that's one thing. So having some kind of artificial streams of revenue that instead of coming from government will come from platforms, I'm not sure that's the best way for news. And secondly, I think the most important is that the last thing that the news ecosystem needs is to recreate some kind of dependency to something. I would be very concerned to have a significant amount of money coming from Facebook or Google, as it will recreate some kind of dependency. And I don't think it will be sound. My dream would be to have self-sustained news publication, news ecosystem, but very little dependent on platforms.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely right. So a subsidized press in Germany, where I am now, there is a big movement against the subsidies from the government, and because of the liberty of press.
Yeah, I
So
mean, and actually, there is if we look at the situation in the United States, I mean, they tend to, you have Europe, which tends to beg platforms to give them money. Same thing in Australia. In the United States, which is much more market driven, they tend to refuse the money coming from the GAFA and stuff. So I think they are right. I mean, news needs to be free. News need to thrive on their own sound ecosystem. That's my belief.
thank you so much, Frédéric.
My
Actually, you,
pleasure.
you answered my last question, which was about your vision of the future for a free press
That would be the
yourself.
best way, but it's going to be complicated because I mean the news ecosystem in the future will be much more fragmented. In each country, Germany, France, United States, UK, and stuff, you will still have very solid brands, news brand of great quality newspaper or former newspaper or radios, TV, and stuff, which are going to provide good journalism. The rest will be much more fragmented with a huge number of newsletters and stuff. And I'm not sure where it's going to lead. My concern is that the vast majority of the people will still be informed with social media, which will lead to a very poor quality of information. And my concern that the notion of informed citizen, having people who, when they go to the voting booth, have a sufficient amount of information across all the spectrum to make informed choice. I think this segment will shrink, and the number of people will be defined as informed citizen might be quite small in the near future. That is my concern.
Yeah, that is sounds like a bit of a tragical situation for a democracy. Nevertheless, I think we have to do something against this trends, and maybe with this kind of interviews and with the kind of events that we are doing, we can fight for a good informed citizen of the future. Yeah, so the discussion here can get a little bit more intense with fake news and so
Yeah,
on. It is essential nowadays to have really well-informed people. And I think a free press is essential for that. And thank you so much, Frédéric, for your
my
work
pleasure.
and for your time here. And we are looking forward to welcome you on the 20th of April to our discussion about how Silicon Valley is transforming news business.
My
Thanks so much.
pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.